The Target 12 investigators are going in depth on a problem experts say is plaguing Narragansett Bay: plastics pollution.
URI scientists have found the top 2 inches of the seafloor at Narragansett Bay is covered with more than 1,000 tons of microplastics. And that number has jumped big time in the last decade.
Target 12 investigator Kate Wilkinson joins us from Bold Point Park in East Providence with what new research from URI is revealing about the local impacts.
With the city skyline in view, researchers were not surprised to find the highest concentration of microplastics here. But the sheer amount that they found, they say, is concerning. Victoria Fulfer is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Oceanography at URI. She says microplastics are less than 5 millimeters in size, smaller than a grain of rice, often breaking down from larger pieces of plastic.
Mostly find polyethylene and polypropylene and polystyrene, which are making up over 70% of what we're finding. And those are also the plastic types most commonly found in single-use plastics.
She says these pieces of microplastic are just from Bold Point Park in East Providence.
This was a really disappointing sight to see because you could just look at the ground at this site and see small bits of plastic everywhere, as well as larger items.
It's one of several spots her and Professor J.P. Walsh have looked at over the last 3 years to see how widespread these microplastics are along the Narragansett Bay. The researchers collected samples from the shorelines to the seafloor using URI's research vessel Captain Bert, and then brought them back to their lab on the Narragansett Bay campus. With the help of a laser, they were able to identify pieces of plastic, some so small you could only view them under a microscope.
These brighter spots are where the microplastics are.
Professor Walsh says the amount of plastic they found is similar to other areas of the world, but this was the first study to examine the change in microplastic levels from city coastlines to the open sea.
Well, you go from thousands of microplastics per kilogram to hundreds.
Researchers were also startled by how many microplastics they found in waters surrounded by more rural areas.
The biggest surprise was the higher concentrations in the southern bay on Aquidneck Island and here in Narragansett, because these are areas that have lower populations.
Fulfer and Walsh say that can lead to problems in our ecosystem and the economy.
There's a lot of research showing negative impacts of microplastics when biota ingest them, such as fish or shellfish, and so that can impact our fisheries production and the food that we rely on.
When it comes to making changes, Walsh says you should find ways to avoid single-use plastics and recycle, but he's asking public officials to look at broader changes.
How we encourage industry to evolve and what types of plastics we're using and what we're doing with it after we use it.
Meantime, another URI research team found that microplastics can reach the brains of mice. The potential link to humans, I'll explore that coming up at 6. With the Target 12 investigators, Kate Wilkinson, 12 News.
New details now in a Target 12 investigation: plastics pollution. URI scientists warn there are a growing number of microplastics entering Narragansett Bay.
New at 6, we're learning these plastic pieces, smaller than grains of rice, could pose a risk to your health. Target 12 investigator Kate Wilkinson has what new research reveals.
I was able to find these microplastics here at Bold Point Park in East Providence in just a matter of minutes. But researchers at URI say that they have found that these microplastics can reach the brains of mice, and that could lead to potential health risks. In an area of research as new as microplastics, there are a lot of questions scientists at the University of Rhode Island want answered.
We have to look into that a little bit more.
Professor Jamie Ross is the principal investigator in a study at URI's College of Pharmacy, where they're using mice to see where microplastics go in the body. For 3 weeks, mice were given water with microplastics in it, the same kind used for styrofoam takeout containers. Through this research, they were able to determine that microplastics are toxic to cells. But Ross says this study came with a major surprise. Microplastics managed to get into the brain despite the blood-brain barrier.
And its function is to keep bad things out, so viruses, bacteria, and it should be selective for things like this.
But here it is.
But here it is, and that's what we're trying to understand, especially only after 3 weeks of treatment.
Ross says multiple pieces of microplastic made it through the barrier, but the microscope showed another surprise, a decrease in what's known as GFAP. That's the green dots around the brain.
It's been shown that in mouse models, it could lead to some forms of neurological diseases, including depression and Alzheimer's disease.
And while Ross wants to understand more about the potential health impacts, she says they also noticed when mice were exposed to these microplastics, their behavior changed.
They had more total movements, more anxiety-prone-like movements, but they also spent more time in the center of this arena where we test them, which is more akin to what happens as we get older or we have neurological diseases.
This research out of the College of Pharmacy comes as another team of researchers at URI found more than 1,000 tons of microplastics live on the seafloor of the Narragansett Bay. A RAPE PhD candidate, Victoria Fulfer, says has increased rapidly in the last 10 to 20 years.
I knew that microplastics were a large problem, but I was surprised that they were so prevalent throughout our system, particularly on some of our shorelines that look relatively clean to the visible eye.
The results of both studies bringing along concerns from researchers, but Ross says there are steps you can take to minimize your exposure to microplastics.
Plastic food containers, to use stainless steel or glass, or a beverage container, for example.
Ross says the next step is to figure out how long microplastics stay in the body, but that could be difficult to figure out with humans because we use single-use plastics every day. With the Target 12 investigators, Kate Wilkinson, 12 News.